So today we've got a really exciting webinar hosted by Carmel on crisis management and how to manage and recover from tough events. Carmel is a journalist and PR practitioner with over 30 years of experience, so I think we're safe to say we're in pretty good hands for today's presentation. So we'll start with the presentation from Carmel first, and then we'll move on to some questions at the end. You can
Okay.
put questions in the chat or in the Q&A box. We will get around to all of them, whatever they are, so don't worry about that. And we'll come to them at the end of the presentation. So, Carmel, I will hand over to you now to take us into the world of crisis management.
Okay, hi and welcome to everyone. Just bear with me a sec while I share my screen and hopefully we'll get started. Hopefully you can all see that.
Yep, we can see that.
Wonderful. Okay, brilliant. So this is very much a whistle-stop tour of some of the essentials of crisis management. Ordinarily, and in my previous, until very recently, I was teaching undergraduate and postgraduate students around crisis communications across 12 weeks. And I'm currently working with students on the CIPR Specialist Diploma for Oxford College of Marketing. And that takes longer than an hour, so as it should be. So very much a whistle-stop tour of some of the essentials. So I kind of apologise in advance that we're probably going to be covering quite a lot of ground in a very short space of time, but there'll be time for questions. I understand from Anna that you're going to get a copy of the presentation, and I imagine there'll be an opportunity to follow up and to find out a bit more. So bear with me, ask your questions, probably pick those up towards the end. In terms of my background, as Anna said, I worked as a journalist initially, so the other side of crisis coverage, if you like, and then went into PR, worked in PR for over 30 years, then taught in higher education for 15 years, and my specialism was crisis management. Having said that, I don't have all the answers. Nobody does in a crisis, but there are things that you can do to best position yourself to manage, to recover, and to learn from crises. And that's very much what today is about. So some pictures there just to start you thinking about some of the current and recent events that have constituted crises for different organisations. So we're going to be looking at some examples and their impact. I'm going to look initially at some definitions because it's not always altogether evident what constitutes a crisis. You know, sometimes there are problems that bubble under, but that don't stop the normal operations of an organisation. That aren't necessarily a crisis, but which have the potential to turn into something much more worrying. Were you to be studying this over a longer period of time, we'd look at the practice of issues management and the active management of those kind of smaller scale problems that have that sort of dangerous, worrying potential. So we'll look at some definitions about what constitutes a crisis. Be reassured that it's very much a best practice skill set that clients value. I know when the PRCA in particular does a digital survey of skills year on year, and every year they look at what clients value in the recruits and in their staff and in the people that they hire to do the work that they do. And the ability to manage crisis effectively is always in the top 3 or 4 sets of skills that they really want to see. Clients don't want to be in the eye of a storm without skilled hands to support them and guide them. So learning how to manage a crisis effectively is a really good skill set to have in terms of your employability, but it's also really good practice to know how to handle a crisis. Um, Basically, it's about having a plan. And today, and more broadly, it's about what you can do and why it matters. And this notion that reputation has a value. We'll look at a particular example where this is evident in terms of, if you like, quantifying reputation as an asset on the balance sheet. You know, it has a quantifiable financial value, and why it matters in terms of members of the public. When teaching this to students previously, you talk about something called the consensual license to operate. And if you like, that's that public permission that permits and supports companies to carry on doing what they do. And there are quite a few examples at the moment of companies that aren't doing very well in protecting and promoting their consensual license to operate, and who are being called into question for all the wrong reasons because of the way that they've conducted themselves. The post office is a really good example. Fujitsu is another example. We'll come to that in a bit more detail in a moment. Learning from crisis without wishing to be sort of evangelical in a religious sense, you can learn from really tough things that happen, and actually it makes really good business sense. So weathering a crisis, great. Yeah, there are things you can do to prepare and to manage effectively, but if you don't learn from those crises, you are missing one of the most important elements of being involved in a crisis, being subject to a crisis. So it's about learning to be better. And I'll probably pretty much conclude this session by looking at a very high profile example of where we have paid part of the price or something of the price from an organisation that didn't learn from a crisis and didn't learn some of the lessons that could help prevent things happening again in the future. So I'll save that for a little bit later on. The bad news is crises will happen. They will, whether we like it or not. So yeah, but fasten your safety belts because it will happen at some point. The good news is that you can prepare. You can't prevent them. Ultimately, sometimes things will go wrong. But the good news is that there are things that you can do to position yourself better to cope with that crisis. Advice to me, that's a reference to when I first started working for Derbyshire County Council, who had this wonderful head of PR called Rod Cook. We used to be in the CIPR, the PR Week Power Book, a really, really top-notch PR professional. And I remember him saying to me fairly early on in my tenure there, you can guarantee, Carmel, that at any moment on any day, someone in this organisation is doing something that they shouldn't be, or something is going wrong, and there will be a PR consequence to that. There'll be a consequence for the organisation of that happening. So yeah, so it's an assumption you can make. Think about your own organisations. Maybe that's a kind of downbeat way of looking at the world, but it stands people in good stead by, and it's part of that audit of making sure that you know exactly what's going on as far as is possible from one day to the next. People first in red. Whenever you're managing a crisis, always have at the foremost of your mind, what's the human impact of this on people, either people within the organisation or people outside the organisation? What is that human cost? Because that has got to be paramount, most important when you're dealing with a crisis. It's not about the share value, the share prices. What's the human impact of this crisis on people? And if you keep that foremost in your mind, you won't go far wrong. Okay, some definitions then. Crisis disrupts or affects the entire organisation or has the potential to do so. So that's from Timothy Coombs, who I quite often refer to as the godfather of crisis communications. I'm not sure if he'd thank me for that, but I mean it as a compliment, and certainly one of my most referenced academic sources. Very much the foremost writer in any of the textbooks that take on crisis communications. Timothy Coombs will be top of the list of those who are go-to for their expertise. And he does stress that the notion of perception. Sometimes a crisis can be about how people perceive an issue or an organisation, and that's as real and as tangible as anything perhaps more physical. So perception is as important as an actual tangible event happening. If people perceive something to be a crisis or worrying or damaging, that's got to be dealt with. So perception is everything. Perception, it can just be about perception. And I'll give you an example of that as we get further into the session. Kathleen Fern Banks, a crisis interrupts normal business transactions and can sometimes threaten the existence of an organisation. Absolutely. And that's the kind of, for me, the easiest measure of a crisis is something which stops an organisation in its tracks. Things have to halt whilst the crisis is dealt with. So it's probably a good rule of thumb for you. And you'll all be in different types of organisations, some very small, some much bigger, some with a great potential to have all the kind of planning ingredients in place. Some are, be very much kind of startup businesses. Without knowing more about the audience here, I can't say, but you'll be able to adapt some of this advice to your own organizational circumstances. You can't do everything, no one can. So use the elements of the guidance to apply that to your particular business circumstances. So types of crisis, it can be something like a strike. As we know, we've been subject to industrial action on our transport services. So trains have been subject to repeated bouts of strike action, and that affects people being able to get to work, being able to go see loved ones, getting home for Christmas, all sorts of things. So that's been going on for quite some time. I noticed that the most recently announced round of strike action by ASLEF, the train drivers, because there are multiple unions involved in that, has been called off because there's been some kind of settlement. So that's some good news to start off our week. So it can be strike action. We had the junior doctors strike last week. I'll come to that in a bit more detail in a moment. It can be product boycotts by consumers who are taking a stance on a particular element. It might be around the political associations of a company. So I remember during the 1980s, we had goods that were associated with the South African regime, which was very much identified with apartheid and the separation of races in all elements of society. There was a very strong campaign which encouraged people to boycott particular products. We've seen that more recently in the encouraged boycott of tax evasion companies, so companies associated with using routes to avoid paying their legally applied tax. I think Starbucks and Barclays and all sorts of organisations were subject not only to boycotts of their products, but also to active civil unrest sit-ins by groups of consumers who were unhappy about the way they were conducting their business. So that's another type of crisis. A product failure, things go wrong sometimes. An example I can think of, McLaren, the baby buggies. There was a very famous product failure some years ago where the folding mechanism in one of their best-selling baby buggies was found to be trapping the fingers of small children, and there'd been several accidents involving young children being injured by these buggies and their particular manufacture or particular structure. So the product had to be recalled, and that was had to be dealt with as a crisis by the company in that it halted the normal operation of things. Very much a best-selling product. Actually, even a more famous product failure, which tips into misconduct and crime, was the textbook crisis going back to the 1970s of Johnson & Johnson, and who produced a best-selling painkiller called Tylenol. And Tylenol was you could buy it everywhere in America across the counter, a bit like paracetamol or Nurofen. Tylenol was the go-to painkiller for most households. And it was contaminated with cyanide deliberately, so it was tampered with. It was one of the most famous cases of product tampering. Come out of nowhere, obviously very left field. Who could predict someone wanting to do that? There were a number of people died as a result of this product tampering. But Johnson & Johnson as a company took the very wise decision to textbook response. They recalled the products from sale, they redesigned the products, the packets, they took out adverts telling people that what had happened, what they'd done to address it. It was seen to be acting very, very responsibly as a company. As a consequence, not only did the company recover, Tylenol itself, which was, as I say, returned to the shelves in tamper-proof product packaging, recovered, and Johnson & Johnson as a company was held up as a best practice example of a company that dealt with a crisis really, really well. So it's a nice go-to one for you comparisons. Doing the right thing in a crisis can actually pay dividends in terms of the company's value and the public perception of how companies conduct themselves. Hacking. I went to a scenario rehearsal of an NHS incident which involved malware virus deliberately attacking an NHS computer system. So they had to resort to using satellite phones to communicate during this crisis when all the systems went down. So that's something. I think the British Museum is currently partially disabled in terms of its online presence because of a hacking issue. There doesn't seem to have been a lot of coverage about that, but it's certainly something that was deliberately intended to cause disruption and is doing so. Natural disaster, so things like extreme weather conditions, earthquakes, volcanoes, we'll have a look at that in a moment. Misconduct within an organisation, lots of examples of that, I'm sure. Trying to think of an example. We had a few years ago, we had an example of misconduct in the Patisserie Valerie cake chain, where one of the senior directors was found to have been basically siphoning off money. I have to be careful what to say. This might be subject to legal action. I'm fairly sure that's been done and dusted. But yeah, they stole lots of money from the company, and the company went into economic problems as a result of it. So staff or senior management misconduct is one. Acts of terrorism and accidents. Sometimes things just happen that no one can prevent, and it's just the way that you deal with them, the way that you respond and manage, that's important. Regester and Larkin. Michael Regester and Judy Larkin are acknowledged as two of the foremost writers, along with Timothy Coombe, about reputation and crisis management. They wrote probably one of the earliest textbooks on case studies in crisis management, describe it as a vital commercial asset that organisations squander at their peril. Absolutely. Stakeholder activism is increasing. Consumers, shareholders, employee activists are increasingly vocal. Absolutely. Since the 1950s, 60s onwards, people are much more ready to air their views and to actively participate in that kind of social and political discussion around the way their products and services are developed and provided. And they take a more active position on how companies conduct themselves. So it's not just about being passive and receiving services and goods. It's also about saying, we like the way you do business, or we don't like the way you do business, and you need to clean your act up. And consumers are much more active in the way that they have their relationship with those products and services. So what makes a crisis? Let's have a look at some examples. There's one of my favourites in the picture there. Actually live and work from Scarborough on the East Coast, so I'll make sense of that picture in a moment. I've touched upon the UK government and industrial action. We had the latest in the round of junior doctors' strikes last week, which you might say, well, the NHS is in crisis a lot of the time. There are certainly concerns about the need for greater funding and restructure of the organisation. But the junior doctors' strike tips it into a new level of crisis, in that they have the cancellation of operations, cancellation of patient appointments, and it makes it even more difficult to access services, so certainly accident and emergency services. So our fantastic workers in the NHS are under even more pressure during periods of industrial action. Iceland volcano. So we touched upon natural disaster. Nobody can prevent a volcano erupting. And Iceland, like lots of areas of the world where this kind of geofault or geographical issue exists, is very, very good at dealing with the fallout from the volcanoes erupting. I noticed this morning I was checking on the latest status of Iceland, which was subject to major incident and major emergency planning being activated during the days following the eruption of the volcano. That's now been scaled down as the volcano has begun to subside, and there's no lava affecting the local area. But it involved areas where residents had to be evacuated. There were concerns about the lava erupting from the volcano affecting a local power plant, a geothermal power plant. So, you go from emergency to even more intense emergency, where there's the potential for something much more worrying to develop. But that's actually good news today. That's being scaled down. Things seem to be settling down there. Boeing 737 MAX 9. Now, gosh, I don't know if anyone in the audience works for Boeing. My heart goes out to anyone who works in the press office at Boeing. Over the last 5, 6 years. They've had something of a lively time for all sorts of reasons, none of them good. So I was teaching students about problems with the previous iteration of the 737 MAX in 2019, which had to be grounded after 2 plane crashes involving, I think about 360 people were killed. And it was found to be the fault of a software system that Boeing had, in their wisdom, put into their new Boeing 737 MAX, and which was actually forcing the nose of the plane to tilt downwards. Pilots were having to struggle against this, and it resulted in 2 plane crashes with lots of fatalities. A public inquiry into that particular iteration of the Boeing 737 found that Boeing had cut safety corners in order to maximize profit. Now we're just couple of years further on with the new iteration of the 737 MAX 9, and there've been a number of incidents involving Boeing planes, and they've now been grounded. I noticed last week, in terms of, we talk about reputation, why it matters. Well, it matters for all sorts of reasons. It matters that you do the right thing, particularly where it impacts upon the public. But in terms of the share value of Boeing, last week, $13 billion was knocked off the value of Boeing as a company, as news began to emerge of them being ordered to ground the 737 MAX 9 because of these safety concerns, and they won't be permitted to fly any of this model of aircraft until those concerns have been resolved and satisfied. So $13 billion. Yeah, so wouldn't be the place to be in a press office at the moment at Boeing. The post office, yeah, you've probably been living in a cupboard if you've not been aware of the issue of the post office versus Mr. Bates. 700 sub-post masters affected by IT problems relating to the Fujitsu Horizon computer system, which operates in sub-post offices where we go and buy our stamps. A crisis of confidence, reputation. There's public inquiry at the moment playing out in all its technical glory, some horrific testimony coming through, lots of people's lives ruined as a consequence of an IT system which was not fit for purpose, it seems. Lots to be concluded yet, but at the moment, I was looking at Marketing Week has written an article, it's quite interesting, about the reputational value of post office as a brand and Fujitsu, talking about how the customer and branding recognition levels in terms of positive sentiment towards those brands has absolutely nosedived, as you would imagine, on the back of this scandal, which is still playing out. We've still not got to the bottom of it. But it just gives you an idea of how not only it is about companies being seen to do the right thing, but it also affects reputational value and in turn their financial value, but also that coming back to that consensual license to operate. There was an advert, just from my own perspective, on ITV, I think, the other night, for post office travel insurance. And I don't know about you, but I don't think I would be inclined to buy anything in the way of travel insurance from the post office at the moment. And that's obviously tainted by my perception, that coming back to that idea of perception about how the post office conducts its business. Would I trust them to look after me on my holidays through travel insurance? No, I don't think I would. I'm sure a lot of people are feeling the same way. So just a practical example of how that can matter. COVID-19, we all went through it. Public health crises are, definitely up there at the moment. There are a couple of issues bubbling under about the rise in measles cases. I know when my own kids were growing up, they both had the triple jabs, the MMR jabs, but there has been a downturn in the number of parents who are taking their children for the triple MMR vaccine, and that's led to they've activated a major incident within the UK's Health Security Agency. That's been in the last couple of days because they're so concerned about the rise in the level of measles and the potential public health impact of that allows them to then put in place emergency measures to try and address that, to try and improve that uptake of the vaccine. So sometimes declaring things like a major incident or a major emergency can actually be a technical way of unlocking additional help, financial help sometimes. It can be for things like public authorities, local authorities, if they declare a major incident for something like flooding or snow or a public health incident, that can unlock potential Home Office additional funding to support their response to the emergency. Also, I've put STIs there. Sexually transmitted infections are also on the increase. There's been something like a 25% increase in some areas of the UK of things like gonorrhea and syphilis, which we haven't seen for years. They're not quite clear why this is happening, what the cause is, how best to address it. But that's a kind of, if you like, one that's ticking along and is likely to come to the fore in the declaration of particular measures to address it. It may be they declare a national emergency or an emergency status for that as an issue to trigger that extra help. So sometimes that's a device that can actually unlock extra help for public health agencies. On the opening slide, I showed you a picture of Brandon Battersby, who the toddler who died last week in Skegness. This was a horrible incident. Reported as his father, who's 60, died of a heart attack. He was looking after his toddler son, Brandon Battersby, and his body wasn't found. The father's body wasn't found for 5 days, during which time the toddler, it appears, although it's still being investigated, had starved to death. Horrific as a story, and obviously would have triggered all manner of responses by the police, local services. It was interesting for me to see, because very often one of my first jobs was working with social services departments and doing social services related publicity and looking after things like frontline responses to horrific, very tragic incidents like this. Thankfully, they don't happen very often. Sometimes nobody is to blame. It isn't clear at the moment exactly what happened. It looks very much like the child died because he wasn't found, despite alerts by social services. I noticed in local Skegness related social services, they were very quick, I thought, to put forward a senior social services executive. I think it was their director or deputy director, to field media interviews last week. And that will not have been easy. There will have been all sorts of issues playing out, an assault by media, as is right. You know, you're held to account when something awful goes wrong. I think there is a tendency sometimes to see social services as the baddie a bit too quickly in this country, where I think, you know, under stretched resources, local government is doing its best to protect and provide frontline services as best they can. So the investigation will show exactly what happened, but I thought as a media issue and as a crisis management communications issue last week, it was dealt with pretty well by the local social services department in the midst of something that must have been awfully distressing for everybody involved, the family, all those who would have been subject to that. Fake news. There's nothing new in fake news. Fake news has been going on for, well, centuries. Certainly not new, but and certainly it's used very much as a weapon during times of conflict. So in wartime, you'll find fake news is used very typically. I think we've been seeing a little of that in the Israeli-Gaza conflict. Won't get into that, far too sensitive topic, but we've certainly seen it in the Iraq War. We saw it in the First World War and the Second World War. So fake news stories designed to flip support from one side to another. It's a tactic that's used. It's also very worryingly used. And again, this is something that I would teach in a much longer session had we got the time. But examples of where I've been subject to fake news. So going back to my time at Derbyshire County Council, we had to activate the press office and get the whole press team in over one weekend at the time of the death of Princess Diana, which was 1997. So it was a time before social media, but there'd been a fake news story in the Sunday Mirror which said that, and there was this outpouring of grief when Diana was killed in that awful car accident. There was an outpouring of public grief. So books of condolences were opened at all public body outlets, and our council offices was no different. So we had a book of condolence in County Hall in Matlock, where people could come in, they could write poems, they could write messages, they could express their grief in a very public and very personal way. So a story had reached the Sunday Mirror that Derbyshire County Council had basically shredded or disposed of unceremoniously some of these books of condolences. There'd been too many of them. They discarded them on a public tip. And it was absolute nonsense. But such was the kind of, I suppose, national outpouring of grief that this story played to a very feverish media landscape. And so our phones were absolutely ringing off the hook at a time when it was just landlines. So we had to deal with inquiries. I remember at one point we were obviously quick to rebut the story, to make sure that we had the evidence, that all the books of condolences were intact. Nothing like that had happened, nor would we dream of doing so. But that had to be dealt with very, very quickly and very, very firmly. And I vividly remember, and anybody who watches The Crown as a series on Netflix may recall the character of Mohammed Al Fayed, father of Dodi Al Fayed, Diana's boyfriend at the time of their deaths. And I was on the phone to his press secretary, Michael Cole, who's an ex-BBC journalist, reassuring him that we certainly hadn't done this, and nor were we ever likely to do this. So, but about 6 people's day, Sunday, was taken up in trying to rebut this fake news story. Another example of a fake news story in Washington, and this is around the kind of fever over Trump, and I think we're probably going to see more of this in the run-up to the US general election this time. Fake news stories were circulating that Hillary Clinton was part of a sexual abuse ring in Washington, that she was a paedophile, and that she ran this sexual abuse paedophile ring from a pizza restaurant in Washington called the Ping Pong Restaurant. And I mean, it all sounds terribly outlandish, but this was being advanced by some of Trump's more high-profile, strange media outlets. Alex Jones is one of them, who, which has been sued over his comments about the Sandy Hook shooting tragedy. So fake news. So this was picked up on Facebook and on Reddit by somebody who believed it, who went to the ping pong restaurant with a shotgun, determined to root out the paedophiles, who were meant to lurk in the basement of this restaurant. There isn't a basement in the ping pong restaurant. Anyway, turned up with a shotgun, shot the lock off the door to the restaurant. There were kids inside playing table tennis and people having pizza. And obviously this misguided person was arrested. But this activity was prompted by fake news, prompted by some of the more outlandish stuff which we associate with Donald Trump. And unfortunately, I think we're likely to see stuff like this again. So it's not just funny, it has consequences. Fake news has consequences. And unfortunately, it's one of the elements of crisis that perhaps is a bit more left field, but that we may have to deal with. I certainly had first-hand experience of dealing with the fallout from one element of fake news. Thor the Walrus, to move on quite quickly, or we're not going to get through all this. Thor the Walrus, Scarborough Council, I live in Scarborough, so Scarborough Council could be forgiven for not having an emergency communications crisis plan for the arrival of an adolescent walrus. That's what happened just over a year ago. Thor the Walrus arrived, described as an adolescent walrus. He landed and had a little rest for about a day and a half on the slipway to the harbour where all the pleasure boats go out, and caused an absolute storm of interest. So we had people coming from far and wide. The town was besieged by extra tourists. We had the world's media coming to film this beautiful animal. All normal operations on the harbour had to stop. There was a police cordon around the area to keep away people stop people getting too close to Thor, as he had a bit of a snooze and had a bit of a scratch. Adolescent walruses, obviously He was also into self-pleasuring himself, which caused something of an embarrassment for some of the correspondents trying to describe, oh, what's he doing, mummy? So describing what the walrus was doing on the slipway to the harbour. The lookout on the harbour, which is a really lovely restaurant, were absolutely besieged by media photographers who would go in and buy a cup of coffee for the duration just to film Thor the walrus. The reason this caused a crisis is that obviously it stopped the normal operations of things for the town. Police had to be involved. They had to cordon off the area. Traffic had to be diverted. They actually had to cancel. There was an obscure part of the Countryside and Wildlife Act was referred to, which was about not disturbing wildlife, protecting the welfare of wildlife. And so the Thor arrived just before New Year's Eve, when there's normally a grand fireworks display in the harbour in Scarborough as part of the kind of annual celebrations. So that the fireworks display had to be cancelled because of Thor, which everybody understood. Everybody was fine with that. I think the alert that he was actually there was first thrown up on a Facebook group by one of the Scarborough bird watching groups. But obviously the credit for this has been claimed by many, many groups since then. So, but yeah, I think Scarborough Council had to deal with the world's media. The world stopped, certainly normal operations stopped for 2 or 3 days in Scarborough as a result of this animal choosing to have a rest. So on New Year's Eve, just before midnight, he decided to go and carried on his journey around the coast and up to Northumbria, and then on to all sorts of further climbs. I think he might have ended up in Iceland at one stage. So yeah, and he was had such an impact that the local theatre wrote a pantomime, which was performed this year about Thor the walrus for local children. So yeah. So, but I think it's one of those, sometimes you can't predict. You wouldn't be able to look at an audit of your organisation and predict exactly that particular circumstance happening. Right, and move on. The role of PR. So dealing with a crisis is a specific PR skill set. You're desperately trying to establish the facts. You're inundated with social media messages, calls and demands from the media. You're trying to find the answers to key questions. You're working in the eye of a storm. It's chaos, absolute chaos. What you need is a crisis plan. I'm going to move things on now. So what you can do is get organised. First thing is know your client or organisation inside out. Forgive me, but know where the bodies are buried. Know where things have gone wrong in the past. Know where things are perhaps less than perfect. Think the unthinkable. Analyse what has happened before. Do your research. What has happened before? How did it go? How well was it looked after? You can't prepare for everything. Resources are finite. So focus on the most likely scenarios. And you can do a simple risk assessment where you can give, if you identify within your organisation, I don't know, I was talking to a student yesterday who was talking about the risk of money laundering within a financial organisation. So that's a fairly strong likelihood that something like that will arise. So you could give that particular potential crisis a score out of 5, with 5 being the highest. Of course, what that risk assessment doesn't do is tell you what the potential impact is. So a slightly more complex risk assessment formula is provided by Timothy Coombs, which looks at the likelihood out of 10 times the impact out of 10, and you can come up with an overall score, which would be in the hundreds for that particular crisis scenario. So look at the most likely ones. You can't prepare for everything. None of us have got finite resources are finite. You haven't got endless amounts of time or money to spend. So look at what's most likely and prepare for those crises arising. Have a crisis management communications plan. Make sure you have a crisis response team and that they know that they're part of that response team, that they know what their roles are, what's expected of them. You can prepare template holding statements. You can have press releases and other materials that can be ready with basic information in place, but then to be completed and ready for use when the specifics of each crisis becomes apparent. You can prepare for a crisis press conference. Obviously, decisions about press conferences need to be taken very, very carefully. It isn't necessarily a good idea to have one, but it's something that can be a useful device. At the end of this session, there's a list of links to press conferences that I think will be really useful in broadening people's understanding of how they can work really well or perhaps not so well. Monitor media coverage and activity. So it's no good doing all this communications in a crisis unless you know how it's playing out. So look at what the media is saying, how it's using your information. Is it using it in full? Is it using it partially? Is it using it accurately? How well is it being used? If it's not being used well, why is that? What can you do to address that? So monitor and actively manage your media work and your media coverage. And then evaluate and learn the lessons. And we're seeing at the moment, aren't we, public inquiries which are doing precisely that around COVID-19, the public inquiry. Only recently we had the conclusion of the Manchester bombing, the Manchester Arena bombing inquiry, and the Grenfell inquiry, which continues as well. So good examples of where publicly lessons are being learned from terrible tragedies. Make sure that online and hard copies are available, because if you think about the malware and IT attacks and hacking attacks, you need to have hard copies as well to make sure that you can respond under any given circumstances. I know when there was a malware virus attack on one of the NHS trusts, they had to use satellite phones for communications. So, you know, think through what are the ramifications of particular scenarios on your capacity and ability to communicate in a crisis. Get organised. Crisis response team. The team manager is often the public relations head of PR. Depends on the size of your team. I would always counsel that you don't have a key spokesperson from your communications team. It sets up a perception of a kind of PR front. There are those who take a different stance on that, but for good or ill, I always counsel that it should be either a senior executive or whoever's most usefully close to the core issue that's causing the crisis. Your key spokesperson should be ideally media trained or someone who's really, really good at coping with the pressure from media interviews, and should be 5 C's aware. So any of the students who might have studied crisis management will know that's about expressing clarity, control, concern, confidence, and competence. And those qualities are absolutely invaluable in a crisis. So being clear about how you communicate, exercising a sense of control is about bringing an element of calm to bear on what can be a very chaotic situation, expressing concern about the human impact, showing confidence that you know how to deal with this and you are making decisions and that you are competent to do so. Other members of the crisis response team could come from operations. So if it's a car manufacturer, should be somebody from the manufacturing section. Very often you'll have somebody from your legal advice if the scale of your organisation extends to that, but you might need to seek legal advice on your response and how you communicate. Bear in mind that a legal advisor will always want you to say nothing in a crisis, so you will very often have to argue your case for the good practice of communicating and continuing to communicate in a crisis, because we know from research that companies that do communicate and carry on doing so competently and credibly recover better and are better perceived by their audiences. It might be someone from HR or finance, and obviously it's going to be crisis specific. Make sure you've got contact details and that they have prior awareness and ideally training in what they're doing. A priority ordered list of key publics from customers, board members, suppliers, investors, employees. Absolutely make sure that you're talking to other members of staff within the organisation as a priority. They should not be last in the line to hear about what's going on and how it's being dealt with. They are ambassadors for your organisation. Trade unions, government and media. And I think media are a separate group for me. Make sure you have a media directory with named contacts and groups that are specific to your organisation. So anything from local and regional media, online media, social media, but also trade media as well, and national and international. And make sure you have those up to date and really good dynamic lists. Media as a group, you're looking at that paid, earned, social and owned media. So paid, typically in a high profile crisis, you might see paid media, which is advertising. It's something like a corporate apology. So 2 examples of how this was used, and product safety recalls very often use paid for advertising. KFC, when it ran out of chicken a few years ago, they used a paid-for advert in across all the kind of national newspapers to apologise to customers in a fairly quirky way, which is consistent with KFC's brand. Oxfam, when there was a scandal about the inappropriate sexual behaviour of some of their employees in different parts of the world in places where aid was being provided, they took out paid advertising to apologise to supporters and stakeholders. Earned media is your media coverage, so that which you achieve through online, print and trade. It needs ongoing monitoring, and you need to keep that feed going. So tell it fast, keep talking, keep talking. Don't be afraid to say no if you haven't got all the answers, because you won't have all the answers in a crisis. Social media is useful, direct, and needs monitoring. For those of you who use scheduled tweets and scheduled content, you need to consider pausing and reviewing that content in a crisis, because it can clash and be insensitive and be inappropriate to the crisis that's playing out. And we know that about 60% of PROs, according to a recent survey by Muckrack, amongst others, PROs are using, about 60% of PROs are using AI to generate content and to generate social content, particularly, and to do research and to write press releases. Great, it's great if it helps, but there needs to be, particularly in a crisis, that exercise of human curation and scrutiny about that content needs to be doubly so, to make sure that nothing inappropriate is going to be issued that can trip you up in a crisis. So use AI, but be aware that human curation, that human oversight, is absolutely crucial in a crisis. Owned media is your corporate websites, where you can cite things like statements, releases, chief executive messaging. You can have ready to print off leaflets, background information, photo libraries with different resolution images, B-rolls, features, and a dedicated crisis section. This image is from one of the New Zealand regions where they regularly have earthquakes, and they're very used to crisis management and crisis preparation. So drop cover hold is advice to householders about preparing themselves, protecting themselves in a crisis. So key tools in terms of communication at a crisis: your holding statement will be issued within the first few moments. Your media release will be in the first few hours, and I'll give you a suggested structure, which we might not get time to talk about that in detail on this section, but it is on the slides. Website, you can prepare a lot of that in advance to be activated and made available when the crisis strikes. And again, areas of the world where they're subject to crises very regularly. New Zealand, they have hundreds of earthquakes every year. Most of them aren't particularly troublesome, but every now and again there'll be a massive disruptive earthquake, and they activate their websites, their dark site websites, with loads and loads of useful public information, and they do regular update bulletins. You can also prepare something called a Q&A, question and answer, with core factual information. And in a crisis, it is possible to anticipate quite a number of the questions that are likely to come up from the media. And a Q&A can serve both as a shortcut for media, but also as a support aid for your spokespeople. Leaflet can be prepared, the core of it, within a few hours, and distributed either as a download, but also in paper form during a crisis. So particularly if you've got, say, extreme weather conditions or flooding or disruption, printed copies are going to be absolutely invaluable, and the distribution of those to evacuated householders. Media content, so generic media content, so what's sometimes called boilerplates, which is basic information about your organisation, plus things called B-rolls, which are, if you like, generic pieces of film about an organisation. They can be used to keep that media feed for information going, and corporate information. Holding statement, so it needs to be, before detailed information is available, it won't say very much, but what it will do is establish your organisation in the line of sights for media communications, so that they know to go to you. So the date and time of issue, the number of issues, so there's a clear chronology of when that's gone out, the name of an organisation or a person. Provide as much confirmed detail as you can, include if you're working with other agencies. Have you activated your public information system, your hotline number, your crisis website, if so, include that. And end with providing more information. This whole is likely to be 2 paragraphs for the whole of the holding statement, not very much, but it's about getting something out very quickly. So you can refer back to that when you've got a copy of the slides. Press release is the who, why, what, when, where, and how of the crisis situation. Your crucial introductory paragraph, no more than about 25 words in terms of style. Include a quote, contact details for follow-up, and some of the elements that I've already mentioned to you. Company and partner web links, Facebook and X feeds, whichever social media you use. In priority order in terms of the information to be provided, the nature of the incident and the location, details of fatalities, but numbers, not names, casualties, numbers, not names. That information tends to be confirmed and provided through the police rather than the organisation, not least because the relatives of those affected need to be contacted and made aware first. Details of areas affected, a quote from a spokesperson, reminder about the people first emphasis. Make sure you keep that uppermost in your mind, the idea of the human impact of what is happening before any other consideration. I've talked about, I'll skip past this because we're running out of time for some of the other elements. Yeah, it is an essential tool. You can have it ready and it can be updated very quickly. I think we've covered some of this anyway earlier in the section. Keep staff informed. It's no longer possible to ensure that staff don't learn new information via media. They're absolutely a key audience. So remind them also of the policy on the media. And that's not a gag. It's about saying, should you be approached by the media, please advise them to contact our press office. Journalists are no respecters of boundaries. I know, because it's about getting the story. It's, you know, okay, you want me to do that, isn't necessarily what I'm going to do. They're there to get the story. So, you know, just because you don't want them to approach your staff members is apropos of nothing. So do remind your staff that they can direct them to the press office. And they'll probably be very relieved to have that reminder. Most people don't want to talk to journalists because they're terrified of them. Most journalists are lovely people, but their job, absolutely, and they are always on duty, is to get the story regardless. Update bulletins as the picture emerges, key facts can be confirmed. Don't be tempted to people please. There'll be new information coming through all the time. By that I mean, you know, you'll want to be able to confirm certain things that you're not absolutely sure of. This is not the moment to take risks with information. Take your time. If you're not absolutely sure of the factual information that you can update, don't do it. The fact that you don't know the answer to certain things is absolutely fine, and media will generally understand. You know, they won't always be reasonable, but certainly they will understand, given the nature of a crisis is quite chaotic, that it will take time for certain elements to be confirmed. But keep that media feed going. Tell them what you can when you can do so, but do so safely. Q&A as a support aid for the crisis team. So I think I'd say 6 to 8 questions maximum for that. And it's a shortcut, as I say, for the media, but can help your spokespeople as well. So you can anticipate certain questions from the media, which will be, who's to blame? How can you allow this to happen? Will you be compensating the victims? And then specifics to the crisis. So there's certain things that you can anticipate. A word of caution about press conferences. Be really careful about holding press conferences. Sometimes they are really useful. They're a good way of getting key people in the same place to provide information, but they can also be a media feeding frenzy. Make sure your spokespeople are prepared and ideally have some element of media training or media awareness, or this thing can backfire. And the history is littered with terrible press conferences where things have gone terribly badly. And sometimes you'll have chief executives and senior board members wanting certain things in terms of press conferences, but you have to sometimes stand your ground and say whether it's a good or not a good idea. Be clear on the purpose and role of the spokespeople at the press conference. Get somebody to make a clear start and a finish so that journalists know exactly what to expect in terms of their time commitment. They're busy, they can't be there forever. They need to know whether it's going to last 15 minutes or 20 minutes. The mic is never off. So again, there's the famous Gordon Brown bigot gate. where he thought the mic was off when he got back into the car during a run-up to a general election campaign. As we know, the history tells us that people were able to hear what was being said. That's just one example. There are lots of examples where politicians or senior executives have continued talking to the media a little off guard, and that is then reported. So the mic is never off, and journalists are always on duty. And they might be very friendly, lovely people. I've got lots of friends who are journalists, but they're there to get the story. They're not there to keep you happy. Be clear, concise, and succinct. Understand how journalists work and think. Do not be drawn into agreeing with something if you don't actually agree. And then, very importantly, review and learn what went well, what could be improved. The crisis team, how well did they do? Are they the right people? Do you need to include other people on the crisis team? What are the media training needs? Make sure that you do a thorough review of media coverage. Key messages: was the helpline used? Were there any social issues or wider issues arising? How were they resolved? Crisis scenario planning. It is possible to have rehearsals around crisis scenarios. Just an example there for me, I took a group of journalism and PR students to a crisis scenario rehearsal at Robin Hood Airport when it still existed, where we had the simulation of a leak of aviation fuel and the arrival of refugees to the airport. And it was about examining how the airport managed that process, how it coped with media interest. So we had our PR students managing the PR function, communicating, and the journalists students asking the questions and putting the executives and the university management under pressure. So that was quite a useful exercise in ironing out the kinks and finding out what works well and what went badly. But it's a typical thing for an organisation. Public sector agencies are really good at doing that. Ask your stakeholders what went well and look at other resources or training needs. So we're nearly there. Sorry, we've had to rush towards the end of this. These are some, I'm not going to play these links. These are there for you to have a look at in your own time, but they're examples of press conferences. I'd recommend the Todd Schmadera one. Is the police chief in Omaha, where there was a horrible shooting, police officers were killed, and he delivered an absolute textbook press conference expressing regret, concern, the human impact, but really doing an excellent job on managing a very difficult situation. So review of the essential steps, finally, is recognise and identify what potential crises exist in your organisation so that you can prepare for the most obvious ones, anticipate what issues might arise, plan, train and prepare. It'll put you in much better stead to manage those effectively. You can learn, review and evaluate, and then look at the wider effects. And increasingly it is about listen first. Make sure you're listening to those conversations online and through your stakeholder kind of consultation mechanisms. Make sure you're listening to what people are saying about your organisation as a regular and ongoing kind of dialogue, listening exercise, and you'll pick up lots of useful elements along the way. Okay, actually, just very, very quickly before then, actually, no, we'll leave that. We've probably done as much. Any questions coming through?
Yes, so we've got a few questions. I'll read them out because not everyone can see all of the questions that have come through.
Okay.
So we have a question here saying that the understanding is that PR involvement tends to occur before an incident or crisis has even become public knowledge. So this person wants to know at what stage do PR firms get involved, and to what extent does this complicate your job as a PR specialist?
That's an interesting one. PR involvement tends to occur before an incident or it has become public knowledge. Well, you're lucky if that's the case these days, to be honest. You tend to be next in line. It's more likely than not these days that most crises will become apparent via social media or via leak, but social media particularly. So if you get a little bit of interval time between being aware of that and that becoming public knowledge, then that's a luxury these days. We used to refer to what's known as the golden hour in public relations for crisis management. That doesn't exist anymore. You're pretty much responding as things are playing out. So you really do, your best option, your best hope is to be as prepared as you can by anticipating the most likely crises that are going to come through, and be prepared with things like holding statements and press releases and all the devices that I've just talked through. Could I elaborate on how organisations prepare for potential crisis stemming their operations? Yeah, I think we've covered, you know, if you work for an oil company, the idea of auditing what are the likely crisis scenarios that are going to play out for an oil company. We had the Deepwater Horizon disaster involving BP back in 2010. As we know, that wasn't handled very well at all by BP at the time. They will have learned lots of lessons from that particular example. Poor Tony Hayward, the chief exec at the time, who's no longer with the company, I don't think, was dreadful as a PR spokesperson for the company. But I think look at the core function of the business and identify what are the likeliest scenarios to arise from that core business. You know, what is the likely impact of that, and use those scorings that I've mentioned to you on the two risk assessment models I mentioned earlier in the session to guide your preparations. And the best thing you can do is be as prepared as possible. You can't prepare for everything, but you can position yourself to recover and to manage better if you anticipate some of the most likely crises. Okay, that's probably that one. Got some more on the chat. How to deal with a massive amount of negative social media posts. Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, can we, could you read the questions out, because not everyone can see them.
No, deal with a massive amount of, someone's asking how to deal with a massive amount of negative social media posts. You can't answer each and every one, and we have to recognise that no one's got infinite resources. So the best thing is to have a well-crafted holding statement and a more expansive press release statement that you can provide via your social media feeds. You can't individually answer all social media posts. It's just not possible, particularly if you're dealing with it, you know, something on a massive scale. And should we communicate a crisis across all media channels once it's become public knowledge? It's a judgment call ultimately. If it's become public knowledge and it's escalating across social media, the chances are it's going to be picked up by your more mainstream media and your key media targets. So it's much better to be on the front foot and to communicate, this is what we know, this is what we're going to do about it, we'll keep you informed. We don't have all the information at the moment, but once we have an update and we have a clearer picture of what's happening, we will update the situation. So I think it's about using those devices, which I know we're in the age of social media, but actually some of the principles and core activities don't really change. You can use those statements and press releases to update a very wide audience. So individually responding to social media posts, it's just not possible. You can't do that. There aren't enough hours in the day. Any others? Have we got more?
There's a few on the Q&A. Shall I
Oh yeah,
read them out?
Yeah, that's okay. So when crisis hits, what's the general time frame that an organisation should issue a first statement or put up a spokesperson, even if just acknowledging it until they have more information? What time frame? That's where the holding statement comes in. That can be ready and updatable within a few moments. So I would argue that that needs to be updated and provided within the first few minutes. You can certainly do it within half an hour. It doesn't need to necessarily say a lot. It's about establishing your organisation as a central point of authoritative communication so that the media knows to come back to you. And basically you're saying, and use the template that I've provided. It's about saying, we're aware that something's happening, haven't got lots of details. This is what we're doing. We'll update you as soon as the picture becomes more clear, but that should be done within moments. In terms of putting a spokesperson forward, I wouldn't do that in the early moments. It isn't necessarily going to be helpful if they haven't got much to say, but it'll become apparent at some point in the hours that follow. It depends on the crisis, when that's going to be something that's useful to do. It depends whether it's a public sector crisis, whether it's something to do with commercial interests, and whether something like a press conference might be useful, but it'll be a judgment call. I would say certainly in the early moments, that's not something you would do to put a spokesperson forward. Top tips on training a spokesperson who is to face the media. I mean, that's a whole other session, which we just haven't got time to go in for here, but I'd sign up for the specialist diploma in crisis management, because yeah, there's a whole art form to managing the media. And I don't mean that you become this stultified, controlled spokesperson. It's about understanding how the media works, and how to manage that effectively, how to understand and to anticipate some of the pitfalls of working with the media, as well as the positive benefits. I've got something here. It says, as you say, the Pizzagate conspiracy was truly shocking, but from a PR perspective, how do you effectively manage a fake news story? By being prepared. Sometimes you can't anticipate these things, but you can have basic communications tools in place that you can update and that you can use to respond to those issues as they arise. It's not perfect, but you can be much better prepared if you anticipate and identify these crises as early and as quickly as possible, and make sure you've got a well-prepared crisis team in place. Kirsten Magazdi, how should organisations respond when the action of an individual brings the organisation into disrepute? So Hugh Edwards, BBC made no comment for ages, and the speculation, who is left? Oh yeah, that was an interesting one, and I was working with other journalists at the time when this, and we all knew it was Hugh Edwards. Most people did. It's a difficult one because you have to take legal advice on the implications for naming that person, and the response that's going to have for the person who is then identified as being associated. So that's probably more sensitive and more tricky, but you'd have to look at the specifics of it, take legal advice, take HR advice, but say something. You have to say something, and that's where your holding statement comes in. We're aware that there is speculation. You would have to tailor it to the specifics of that scenario, but there is something that you can say fairly early on, within the first moments, few hours, few days, that actually make it look as if you were in an authoritative, competent, calm and controlled place, the 5 C's. Gosh, lots of questions here. I've got someone, will AI help us prepare for any crisis an organisation may face, given how powerful it is becoming? And how will the rise of AI impact the role of a PR specialist? Could this job be lost as a result? I think AI is helpful in terms of its potential to assist PROs in generating content. It can save time. I would add a word of caution that particularly in a crisis, you need to have human scrutiny and oversight on any AI content, because it might not, well, there is no reason for artificial intelligence to have an awareness of some of the specifics and sensitivities of a crisis situation. So you need to be doubly careful about what is being generated and how that is being used. And I'd particularly caution that on your social media feeds and things like scheduled tweets and scheduled content. Make sure you know exactly what's going out and when, because you might need to pause that process, particularly in a crisis. Liv Cooper. Hello, Liv Cooper. Hello. It's an old student of mine who's doing amazing things now. How should we identify a good spokesperson? It's a difficult one, isn't it? And it's about someone who's a good communicator, who has credibility, who comes across as being calm, who comes across as being sincere, who is sincere, someone who looks like they could handle a crisis, it's the 5 C's again: clarity, control, concern, confidence, competence. If they exude those qualities, they're probably going to be a good choice as a spokesperson. And having seen Liv in action in a press conference as a student, I think you'd do really well as a spokesperson. But thank you for your question. Are there any other questions? I'm aware that we're over time now.
I think we're going to have to, sorry to everyone else who still had questions to go, I think we're going to have to leave it there just because of time. But if you are interested in finding out more on this very interesting and relevant topic, please do check out our specialist diploma in crisis communications. I've put a link in the chat, and everything that we've just had, as Carmel said, a whistle-stop tour today, that will go into much greater detail, and will get you a certified qualification from the Chartered Institute of Public Relations. So if this piqued your interest and touched on some topics that you thought were really useful and valuable, please do check out the course, because it will go into much greater detail. I think that's everything. Thank you very much to everyone who joined. We hope you found it interesting and enjoyable. And thank you, of course, to Carmel for that really thorough, interesting tour of crisis management and what we can do to be prepared and how to manage it when it does happen. So thank you very much. I hope you all have a very nice afternoon. And we'll get the recording and the slides over to you in the next couple of days.
Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. Good luck with all those crises.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.